At 31 years old, I sat at my sister's wedding rehearsal dinner and listened to my own mother tell 40 strangers that I had ruined our family's name out of jealousy. She didn't whisper it. She stood at the head of the table under the soft yellow lights of a rented vineyard hall, and she said it like a woman who had been practicing the sentence for a long time and was finally glad to let it out. What none of them knew, not my mother, not my sister, not the man whose ring was already on her finger, was that I had spent the previous 14 months building something they couldn't argue with, something colder than memory, something that wouldn't change its shape no matter how many times someone looked directly at me and told me I was wrong. And in 9 days, a forensic accountant, a retired detective, a woman named Sonia Vreeland, who I'd never met until 8 months ago, and a very specific set of wire transfer records were going to walk into a room and settle everything my family had been quietly refusing to settle for 3 years. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it actually began, on a Tuesday morning in the waiting room of a bankruptcy court, when I found a file that had my dead father's name in it and a company address that had never existed. Welcome to Calm Drama Stories. My name is Cecelia Marsh, and this is the story of the thing I learned to carry alone, and the day I finally put it down in public. Part 1. What We Bury. My father died on a Thursday in early November. Cardiac event, the doctor said. He was 58, and he was behind his desk when it happened, which would have pleased him enormously, because my father, Gerald Marsh, believed that men who died behind their desks were the only ones who'd lived correctly. He built Marsh and Associates Financial Planning from nothing. That was the story we were raised on. A boy from a small city in eastern Ohio who'd gotten his securities license at 22, built a client roster by cold calling from a phone book, and turned 20 years of grinding work into a firm with 11 advisors, a downtown office suite with carpet so thick it swallowed sound, and a reputation solid enough that his clients sometimes named their boats after him. Gerald was a builder, a provider, a man whose word was his ledger. That was the story. I'm a forensic accountant. I should tell you that up front because it matters to everything that follows. I work for a mid-sized litigation support firm in Columbus, and my job is to find the money that people are trying not to be found. I do it for divorce proceedings and insurance disputes and civil fraud cases, and I am very good at it in the quiet, unglamorous way that involves a lot of spreadsheets and very little drama. The irony of what I was about to find in my own family's finances was not lost on me. Not for a single day. When my father died, he left a will and an estate that looked straightforward on the surface. The firm was to be split equally between his 2 children, myself and my younger sister, Petra. The house and personal accounts went to my mother, Lynette. There was a small life insurance payout, a modest portfolio, and a firm valued, according to the estate attorney, at approximately $1.4 million. Petra and I agreed within the week that we'd sell our shares in the firm to the existing partners, which was the sensible thing. Neither of us worked there. The partners made a fair offer, and we shook hands, and I filed the paperwork, and that, I thought, was the end of my involvement with Marsh and Associates. I thought that for about 4 months. Then I got a call from a man named Dennis Falco, who introduced himself as a former client of my father's, and said that he was in the process of filing a bankruptcy claim, and that some documents in the proceeding had my father's firm listed as a creditor. I wanted to give the family notice, he said, with the careful tone of a man who had thought a long time about how to phrase something. Because the amount they're claiming is larger than what I'd expect, and the account they're claiming through, I've never heard of it. I wrote down the name he gave me, Corin Asset Management, LLC, and I felt the way I always feel when a number doesn't sit right. Not alarmed, just still. Alert in the way a room gets alert when someone walks in who shouldn't be there. "Mr. Falco?" I said. "Can you give me the filing number?" He could. He did. I hung up, opened my laptop, and pulled the public court filing. The address listed for Corin Asset Management, LLC was a UPS store on the east side of Cincinnati. I sat with that for a long time. Then I started pulling threads. Part 2. The Box Under the Stairs. I need to tell you about Petra before I go any further, because this story doesn't make sense without her and because she is the most complicated part of it. Petra is 3 years younger than me and has always been the version of herself that our family preferred. Not because she tried harder. I think she just happened to be born at the right angle for our parents' light. She was sunnier, softer, easier to be proud of out loud. She became an interior designer with a tidy Instagram following and a client list full of the kind of people who say curated without irony. She was our mother's confidant, our father's Sunday golf partner, the daughter who came home for every holiday without being asked. I don't say any of this with bitterness. I want to be precise about that. I loved my sister the way you love someone you grew up alongside, which is to say, completely and with enormous frustration, and with a specific kind of grief when things go wrong. What I say next, I say because it's true, and because the truth eventually mattered more than my discomfort with it. 3 months before my father died, Petra had started dating Marcus Vane. Marcus Vane was 44 years old, divorced, and operated a commercial real estate development company that had been, depending on who you asked, either struggling or growing. He was good-looking in the architectural way, precise features, expensive watches, the kind of handshake that communicates net worth before words do. My father liked him immediately, which in retrospect I should have paid closer attention to. Gerald Marsh liked men who made money the way he recognized himself. He didn't ask how the money was made. He just recognized the shape of the ambition. Marcus proposed to Petra 8 months after my father died, and Petra accepted. And our mother cried with happiness, and I smiled and said all the right things because I hadn't yet pulled that first thread far enough to see what was on the other end. That changed on a Sunday afternoon in February when I was at my mother's house helping sort my father's papers. My mother had kept his home office exactly as he left it, which she framed as grief, and which I later understood was something more complicated than grief. I was boxing up files, nothing more, the ordinary archaeology of a dead parent's desk, when I found a folder tucked behind a box of old client Christmas cards. The folder was labeled Nothing, blank tab, and inside it were two things: a printout of a bank statement for an account I didn't recognize, and a handwritten note in my father's blocky capitals that said only, "Ask D about the LLC before signing." Not until after the Vane deal closes. The Vane deal. I photographed both pages with my phone and put the folder back exactly as I'd found it. My hands were steady. My face was even. My mother was in the kitchen making coffee, and I could hear the particular song of cabinets and cups and the everyday domestic noise of a woman who had no idea her dead husband's office had just said something to me. I drove home, I made a list, and I started pulling a second thread. Part 3. 14 months of quiet. I want to be honest about what the next 14 months cost me. I am not a woman who talks easily about cost. My professional training runs toward documentation and away from confession. But if you're listening to this story because something in your own life has gone quiet and suspicious and your family keeps telling you that you're imagining the shape of the thing, then I want you to understand that the work of finding the truth is long and it is lonely. And there are weeks when you wonder if the price of knowing is higher than the price of not knowing. I decided the price was worth it on the day I requested Gerald Marsh's complete tax returns for the last 7 years of his life, and discovered that Corin Asset Management LLC had been filing as a pass-through entity connected to a holding structure that shared an accountant, a registered agent, and a single beneficial owner with Marcus Vane's commercial real estate company. My father had not been Marcus Vane's victim. He had been Marcus Vane's partner. Let me explain what I found and what it meant, because I am going to take my time with this, because the details matter. Over the course of roughly 4 years, a series of client accounts at Marsh & Associates had been subject to a pattern of what I can only describe as managed erosion, small percentages redirected, fees on fees, rollover commissions that went not to the firm's operating account, but to a subsidiary that lived, on paper, in that UPS store on the east side of Cincinnati. The amounts per account were not catastrophic. They were calibrated, the kind of numbers that fall below the threshold of what a casual client notices when they're reviewing a quarterly statement. The kind of numbers a good forensic accountant notices immediately. The money that flowed through Corin Asset Management eventually found its way into a series of real estate transactions. Marcus Vane's transactions. Some of them were legitimate developments that happened to have a silent financial backer who never appeared in any prospectus. Some of them were deals that never quite materialized, projects that raised capital and then quietly folded, leaving investors with a fraction of what they'd put in and no clear paper trail to follow. The clients being eroded were primarily older, retired, the kind of people who'd trusted Gerald Marsh for decades because he played golf with their husbands and remembered their grandchildren's names and had a voice like a man who would never need to steal from you. I sat with those client files for a long time. Many of them I recognized. Some of those names belonged to people who had been at my parents' Thanksgiving table. I thought about what it would cost a 68-year-old widow to discover that the man she'd trusted with her retirement fund had been quietly redirecting 2% of her growth for 4 years into a holding company she'd never heard of. I thought about that for a long time, and then I went back to work. The person who helped me understand what I was seeing clearly enough to act on was Sonia Vreeland. I should have mentioned her earlier, but I wanted you to understand the shape of what I'd found before I introduced the person who helped me understand its weight. Sonia was 53, black, and formerly a senior investigator with the state securities regulator before she'd retired to consult privately. She was referred to me by a colleague who said, with characteristic brevity, "She's who you want when you're scared you're right." I called Sonia on a Wednesday and explained what I had in 7 minutes flat, using only numbers and documentation references. She was quiet for most of it. "How long have you been sitting on this alone?" she asked. "About 6 months." She was quiet again. "Does your family know you're looking?" "No." "Keep it that way," she said, "for now." "Can you share what you have?" I could. I did. And 3 days later, Sonia called me back and said 4 words that I will remember for the rest of my life. "Cecelia, this is real." Part 4. What my mother knew. I need to tell you about my mother, because it would be dishonest to make her only a peripheral figure in this story. Lynette Marsh was not a woman who missed things. She had been married to my father for 31 years, and she had the particular, finely calibrated intelligence of a woman who had spent decades managing a household around a complicated man and had learned to read the room the way a sailor reads weather. I believe she knew something. I am not sure she knew everything. There is a difference, and I spent a long time trying to locate exactly where on that line she stood. What I know for certain is this. 6 weeks after my father died, my mother made a phone call to Marcus Vane that lasted 47 minutes. I know this because when I eventually obtained her phone records, with her permission, in a moment I'll tell you about, I found it. A 47-minute call. No record of what was said. 47 minutes on a Sunday afternoon, 2 weeks before Marcus had even asked Petra to be exclusive. I also know that when the estate was settled, there was a payment made to a private attorney. Not the estate attorney who handled the will, but a different one, a small firm in a suburb south of Columbus, for services my mother described to me as reviewing Dad's business arrangements. She had never mentioned this to me. She had not disclosed it during the estate proceedings, and the invoice, when I eventually saw it, described the engagement as document review and dissolution consulting. Dissolution of what? The estate attorney found nothing unusual, because the documents that needed to be reviewed had already been reviewed, and whatever needed to be dissolved had been dissolved by then. I want to be careful here because I am talking about my mother, and I don't know, even now, the full shape of what she understood or chose not to understand. I know that when I finally sat across from her, which I will get to, she said something that has stayed with me. She said, "I loved your father the way you love someone when you've decided the alternative is worse." That's not a confession, and it's not an exculpation. It's a woman describing a choice she made so long ago it had calcified into identity. But that was later. For most of those 14 months, my mother was simply present. Present at family dinners. Present at Marcus and Petra's engagement party, beaming. Present at every holiday, pressing my hand and asking if I was doing all right, because I had always been the daughter she had to ask about separately, the one whose all right was harder to read. She asked me once in her kitchen while we were doing dishes after Easter if I had any concerns about Marcus. Just like that, pouring the question into the ordinary noise of the dishwater. I looked at her. "Why do you ask?" She kept washing. "You just seem quiet lately, quieter than usual." "I'm fine, Mom." She didn't push. She turned the water off and dried her hands and said, "You know your sister is very happy." As if happiness were the answer to the question I hadn't quite asked, I said, "I know she is." And I drove home and called Sonia, and we talked for 2 hours about what we had and what we still needed. Part 5. The Witness. I didn't expect. There's a woman named Claudette Oren who has worked as a notary and document processor at a small title company in Columbus for 22 years. She processes closings, witnesses signatures, handles the paperwork that turns promises into deeds. She is methodical, quiet, and has the kind of memory for detail that comes from 2 decades of making sure every line of every form says exactly what it's supposed to say. I found Claudette because one of the real estate transactions in Corin Asset Management's history, a development project on the east side that raised $800,000 from a set of investors and then delivered a parking lot and a stalled permit, had its initial escrow closing handled by her title company. I went to see her on a pretext, which I'm not proud of. I told her I was researching the title chain on a property my firm was involved in for litigation purposes, which was technically true in the abstract sense that all of my work was connected to ongoing litigation at some level. I showed her the address. She found the file. And then something happened that I hadn't planned for. She looked at the file, looked at me, and said, "You know what? The other woman called me too." I held very still. "What other woman?" Claudette closed the folder. "About 8 months ago, a woman who said she was a regulator doing a routine audit. She asked about the same transaction. She had a badge and everything, but I remember thinking her questions were more specific than routine." She paused. "She asked me whether I'd witnessed any signatures I wasn't sure about." I thought about that very carefully. "And had you?" Claudette looked at the table for a moment. Then she said, "There was a signature on the investor escrow that I didn't witness in person. I was told it had been notarized remotely and that I just needed to record the instrument. I did what I was told. But the signature on that document, I pulled it after the woman called me because I still had a copy in my archive. It wasn't the same as the one on file with the county recorder. 2 different signatures, the same person's name." Claudette looked at me steadily. "I made a note of it at the time, and I didn't know what to do with it. I've been waiting for someone official to come back. I told her I worked for a litigation firm and that if she was willing, I'd like to connect her with someone who could take a formal statement. She said, 'I've been waiting 8 months. I can wait 1 more week.' I walked out of that title company and sat in my car in the parking lot for a full 5 minutes before I trusted myself to drive. Because what Claudette had just described was a forged signature on an investor escrow instrument. That was the word that changed the legal terrain of everything I'd been building. That was the difference between a civil matter and a criminal one. I called Sonia from the parking lot. "The other woman who called her," I said. "Do you think it was a real regulator?" Sonia was quiet for a beat. "I think it might have been. I've had some preliminary conversations with a contact at the state office. Nothing official yet. But Cecelia, if there's a parallel investigation already running, we need to get aligned before this comes up from both directions at once. How long do we have? Honest answer? I don't know. Weeks, maybe. Not months." I drove home. I made a list. The list was getting longer and the timeline was getting shorter, and I had not yet told a single member of my family what I knew. Part 6. Telling Sonia the part I'd left out. There was a piece of information I had been holding back from Sonia for 3 months. I'm not proud of that either. I told myself I was waiting until I could verify it. The truth is, I was waiting because once I said it out loud to someone who knew what it meant, I couldn't unsay it. The piece of information was this: Marcus Vane had not met Petra by accident. I found this out through a chain of connections that took me a very long time to trace. What it eventually came down to was a man named Rick Beamer, who had been a junior advisor at Marsh & Associates for 2 years before he quietly resigned 6 months before my father died. Rick had given a deposition in an unrelated civil matter that mentioned, in passing, a meeting he'd attended where my father and a real estate developer had discussed client portfolio diversification opportunities. He'd named the developer. He'd described the meeting as strange. Nothing had come of the deposition because it was peripheral to the case. I found Rick through the public case records. I called him on a Tuesday evening, and I explained who I was and what I was looking at, and I asked him what he remembered. He was quiet long enough that I thought he'd hung up. "Gerald brought the developer in around 2 years before he died," Rick said. "Said he was a client and also a business associate. But the way they talked in that meeting, they already knew each other well, like they'd been working together for a while." "And the developer," I said. "Do you remember what he looked like?" Rick described a man, 40-something, good suit, precise features, expensive watch. I said, "Did you ever hear him mention a woman named Petra?" A pause. "He showed Gerald a photo once, on his phone. Gerald laughed and said she was his daughter, the younger one. The developer said he knew and that it was handled." I wrote down, "It was handled." I stayed on the phone with Rick for another hour. He told me that he'd left the firm when he'd started to suspect the client account irregularities weren't accidents, and he hadn't known who he could trust enough to report to. He'd been 27. He'd been scared. He'd done the calculation that most people in that situation do, the one where the cost of speaking up seems higher than the cost of walking away. And he had walked. "I've been living with that for 3 years," he said. I told him I understood the arithmetic of that kind of fear. I meant it. "If someone came asking officially," he said, "would my coming forward help?" "Yes," I said. "It would help a great deal." "Then I'll do it," he said. "Tell me where to send the statement." I gave him Sonia's contact information, and I hung up and I sat in the dark of my apartment, and I said the thing I'd been holding back out loud to nobody, to the furniture, to the window, to the particular quality of silence that comes with a decision that can't be undone. My sister's fiance had been introduced into our family deliberately. He had known who she was before he'd ever shaken her hand, and my father had known about the introduction. My father had, in some sense I was still working to define legally and emotionally, arranged it. I called Sonia the next morning and told her what I'd left out. She listened without interrupting. Then she said, "All right. Now I need you to listen to me about the next step." Part 7. The conversation I dreaded most. There was one more person I had to talk to before anything moved into official territory, and that conversation was the one I'd been avoiding the longest. I had to talk to Petra. I want to tell you something true about the space between knowing a hard thing and saying it to the person it will hurt the most. That space is not dramatic. It doesn't feel like bravery. It feels like the specific exhaustion of carrying something that belongs to someone else and not having figured out yet how to give it back without breaking them. My sister was 33 months from our last difficult conversation, which had been about whether I'd seemed happy enough at a family dinner 2 years before this. She was engaged to a man I was about to tell her had not accidentally fallen in love with her. She was 3 weeks from her rehearsal dinner. She was, and I want to say this precisely, the happiest I had ever seen her. I met her for coffee on a Wednesday morning at a place she liked near her studio. She arrived with her hair up and a mood like someone who had slept well, and she hugged me and said she was glad I'd called, that we hadn't spent enough time together lately. I ordered something I didn't drink. I looked at my sister and I made a decision about how to begin. "Petra," I said, "I need to tell you something and I need you to hear all of it before you respond." Her face changed, not dramatically, just the way a face does when it understands it's being prepared for something. "Okay," she said. I told her. I told her about Corin Asset Management and the client accounts and the wire transfers. I told her about Claudette Oren and the forged signature. I told her about the connection between Marcus's company and the holding structure. I told her what Rick Beamer had said about the photograph on a phone and it was handled. I told her about the 47-minute phone call in my mother's records. I told her everything I could tell her that was documentable, and I told it to her in order, the way I would tell it to a client, steadily and without editorializing. She didn't say anything for a very long time when I finished. She was looking at the table. Her coffee was going cold. Then she looked up at me, and her face had the particular quality of a woman who is refusing to cry in public through sheer will. How long have you known? All of it? About 3 months. Pieces of it for longer. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Because I needed to be sure enough that you couldn't argue me out of it, I said. And because I was afraid. Of what? I looked at my sister. Of this. Of exactly this. She pressed her fingertips to the edge of the table. She breathed. She said, "Show me the documentation." I opened my bag and took out the folder I'd brought, and I put it in front of her. She read for 20 minutes in complete silence. I watched her absorb it the way she absorbed everything difficult, with a composure that our family always mistook for invulnerability and that I had always suspected was something harder to sustain than it looked. When she finished, she closed the folder and put her hands flat on top of it. "Does he know you know?" "I don't think so." "Mom?" "I believe she knows more than she said. I don't know how much more." Petra looked out the window for a long time. When she came back, her voice was different, not smaller, just differently calibrated. "What happens next?" "Sonia is coordinating with the state regulator. There's likely going to be a formal investigation. The civil side, the defrauded clients, that's already in motion. What happens criminally depends on the evidence the regulator has from their own parallel inquiry." I paused. "Sonia believes an action is going to come whether you or I do anything or not. But she says if we cooperate proactively, it protects you from any implication that you knew." I didn't know. "I know you didn't," I said. "But you're going to be asked to say that on record, and it's better to say it first than to wait." She was quiet again. Then, "What do you need from me?" I told her. She agreed. She left the coffee shop without touching her drink, and I sat there alone and felt something I wasn't expecting. Not relief, not satisfaction. A kind of grief that had the weight of 3 years in it and the specific shape of a sister's face when the floor falls out from under her happiness. I paid for the coffee and I went home and I called Sonia and said, "She's on board." Part 8. The night before everything. The rehearsal dinner was at a vineyard property about 40 minutes outside Columbus. A beautiful place. Converted barn, string lights running the length of the beamed ceiling, long family-style tables draped in ivory linen, a catering staff moving with the quiet efficiency of people who do this professionally and perfectly. My mother had helped plan it. She'd driven out twice to approve the table arrangements. She was prouder of the aesthetic of this evening than she'd been of almost anything in the past 3 years. I drove out on Friday evening in a dress I'd chosen carefully, not because I cared about my appearance in the ordinary sense, but because I understood that the story of the evening would be told later and I wanted to be remembered as someone who had been composed and dignified. I was calm in a way that I think people around me mistook for indifference. Marcus shook my hand in the parking lot and smiled and said he was glad I'd come, and I looked at him and said, "Of course. Wouldn't miss it." And I meant both things. I wouldn't have missed it, and of course I had come. There was nowhere else to be. I should tell you what was already in motion before I walked in. 2 days earlier, Sonia and her contact at the state securities regulator had coordinated the filing of a formal complaint against Marsh and Associates Estate, against Marcus Vane individually, and against 2 other individuals whose names I'll omit because their cases are still proceeding. The complaint was formal, documented, and would become public record within 72 hours of filing. Sonia had told me this. I had not shared it with Marcus or my mother. The civil complaint on behalf of the defrauded clients had been filed the previous Monday. That, too, would be public by the weekend. And Claudette Oren had given her formal statement the previous Thursday. Rick Beamer had given his on Tuesday by phone, with a certified copy of his written statement to follow. I walked into that vineyard barn carrying none of this in my hands and all of it in my chest. I found my seat at the family table between my Aunt Sandra, who is a retired schoolteacher and the most sensible person in our extended family, and a cousin named Leo who had brought his new girlfriend and was paying attention mostly to her. I accepted sparkling water. I looked at the string lights. I waited. My mother found me within 10 minutes. She came to my chair and crouched beside me, a gesture she used when she wanted to speak quietly in a crowd, and she said, You look beautiful. Are you all right? Yes, I said. Are you sure? And there was something in the way she asked it that wasn't quite the usual question. Something underneath. I looked at my mother. I'm sure, I said. Are you? She held my eyes for 1 second longer than she needed to, and then she smiled and stood and went back to her role as the mother of the bride. I watched Marcus across the room. He was performing the evening with the ease of a man who had never had a reason to doubt his own security. Laughing, touching Petra's arm, working the room with the relaxed confidence of someone who believes the future is already settled. He glanced at me once, briefly, and I gave him nothing. A small nod. An unremarkable acknowledgement. And then, 40 minutes in, after the dinner was served and the plates were cleared, Marcus stood to make remarks. He thanked people. He praised Petra. He said something about my father, invoked him warmly, as a mentor, as a visionary, as someone whose legacy he intended to honor. And I pressed my palms flat to the linen tablecloth, and I kept my face exactly even. And then my mother, from her seat at the corner of the table, looked at me with a glass raised in my direction and said the things she said. And to Cecelia, she said, to the table, to the room, who has spent 3 years now making sure we all know what a difficult daughter she can be. I hope this family means as much to you someday as it means to the rest of us. 40 faces swung toward me, some confused, some uncomfortable. My Aunt Sandra put her fork down with a small, precise click. The catering staff moved through the room with the practiced discretion of people who had overheard worse and showed nothing. I looked at my mother. She was looking back at me with an expression I had never quite seen on her face before. Not malice exactly, but the particular exhausted ferocity of a woman defending something she knew, on some level, didn't deserve defending anymore. I said nothing. I picked up my water glass. I took a sip. I set it down, and the silence did its own work. Because 40 people in a room can feel the shape of an injustice even when they don't know the details yet. And the shape of this one. A mother making a public remark about a quiet daughter who hadn't said a word left a residue that silverware couldn't quite clear. Marcus was looking at me now, too, and his eyes had changed. Something shifted behind them. Not guilt, not yet. Something more like the professional calculation of a man reassessing a variable he'd thought was stable. He looked at me for a count of 3 seconds. Then he smiled and said something to Petra, and the dinner moved on. And outside, in a courthouse in Columbus, a clock was running. Part 9. My mother came to me at midnight. I almost left after dinner. I had made arrangements to leave after dinner. Sonia had said there was no necessity for me to stay through the dancing and the prolonged celebration, and she was right, but I stayed. Not for strategy, not because I'd planned it. I stayed because my mother found me on the porch of the vineyard barn around 10 o'clock, in the cool air beside a flowering hedge, where I'd gone to breathe, and she stood next to me for a long time without speaking. The sounds from inside filtered out. Music, laughter, the particular bright noise of a party that had been going on long enough for people to stop performing and start enjoying themselves. My mother and I stood in the dark beside the hedge and listened to it. I know why you've been so quiet, she said finally. I didn't answer. I've known for a while. Her voice was different outside, smaller, like a voice without the room's acoustics to support it. Your father and I. We didn't always talk about his work. He kept things separate. I told myself that was normal, that men like your father needed to keep certain rooms closed. Mom, I'm trying to say something and it's hard, Cece. Let me finish. I let her. After he died, Marcus called me. He said there were some business arrangements that needed to be handled quietly. He said it was for the family's benefit. He said your father had wanted it handled this way. She paused. I hired the attorney. I let him guide me through. Documents that I now understand I should have asked more questions about. What kind of documents? Dissolution filings, entity terminations. He said it was standard estate cleanup. She breathed out slowly. I didn't understand what I was signing away. Or I understood enough and chose not to understand more. I don't know which is truer, and I've been living in that space for 3 years. I turned to look at her. My mother was 61 years old, and she looked in that moment every year of it in a way she usually managed not to. Mom, what are you telling me? I'm telling you I helped bury something I should have let you find sooner. She looked at the hedge, not at me. I'm telling you I chose your father's reputation over the people he hurt. And when Marcus came along, I chose the version of the story that let Petra be happy over the version that was true. A pause. And I've been terrified for a year that you were going to find the whole thing and that I was going to be on the wrong side of it when you did. You are on the wrong side of it, I said. I said it gently. But you're telling me now. She finally turned to look at me. Her eyes were wet. What happens to her? To Petra? She knows, I said. She's known for 3 weeks. She cooperated. Her lawyer has already spoken to the regulator. My mother put both hands over her mouth, stood there, put them down. She didn't tell me. She was protecting you, I said, or protecting herself from having to watch you choose wrong again. I'm not sure which. My mother made a sound that wasn't quite a word. She reached out and put her hand on my arm. I let her. I didn't pull away, and I didn't lean in. I stayed exactly where I was, and I let her hand rest there in the dark, and I thought about everything I'd been carrying alone for 14 months, and I felt, for the first time in a very long time, that the weight had redistributed slightly, spread across more than one set of hands. What do you need me to do? She asked. Talk to Sonia, I said. Tell her what you just told me, all of it. And then? And then we'll see. She nodded. She took her hand back. She looked toward the lights of the party. I should go back in, she said. You should, I said. She went. I stood in the dark for a few more minutes, looking at the flowering hedge, breathing the particular cool grass smell of a vineyard evening. Then I went back inside and found my seat, and I watched Marcus Vane move through the last hour of his engagement party like a man who didn't know yet that the world had already shifted under him. He didn't know. Not yet. But mornings come regardless. Part 10. Monday morning. The formal notification arrived on a Monday. Marcus Vane received a civil complaint and a notice of regulatory investigation at his office address and his attorney's address simultaneously, as is standard. The complaint was a matter of public record. It named him individually and named the various entities through which the scheme had operated. It named the defrauded clients. It named the amounts. It was specific, documented, and 47 pages long. I know this because Sonia called me at 8:45 in the morning to tell me it had been served, and her voice had the particular controlled satisfaction of a woman who had spent 30 years doing difficult, important work and had not lost her belief in its importance. How are you? She asked. I'm okay, I said. I was sitting at my kitchen table with coffee and my laptop and the same ordinary morning light that comes through my window every day. How is it going to move? Quickly on the civil side because the documentation is strong. Criminal. That depends on the DA's office and what they decide to pursue. But the regulator's referral is going in this week and it's got teeth. And Marcus? His lawyer will file motions. He'll argue. He's not a stupid man. A pause. But he built this on the assumption that no one would ever pull the full picture together. Someone pulled it. I looked at my coffee. I thought about my father in his office, behind the desk where he'd wanted to die, building something he'd also been quietly dismantling. I thought about the clients whose names I knew, about the widow whose retirement had been redirected into a stalled parking lot. Sonia, I said, the clients, is there a recovery mechanism? The estate is liable. Some of Marcus's assets can be reached through the civil action. Full recovery is unlikely, but meaningful partial recovery is possible with a strong enough judgment. She paused. You should know that some of the clients have already been contacted by the plaintiff's attorneys. Several of them have asked whether there's any connection to someone who helped bring this forward. I told them that was confidential. Thank you. You don't have to thank me. This is what the work is supposed to do. I hung up. I sat with my coffee and my window and my ordinary morning, and I felt the thing I'd been expecting to feel as a kind of explosion and found instead as a slow, deep exhale, like a door closing that had been open and drafty for 3 years. Part 11. What happened to everyone? I'll tell you because I know you're wondering. Marcus Vane and his attorney spent 4 months in aggressive posturing before agreeing to settle the civil complaint for an amount that the defrauded client's attorneys described as meaningful but not complete. The criminal referral from the regulator resulted in a DA investigation that is, as of when I'm recording this, still proceeding. I won't predict its outcome. The law moves at its own pace, and I've learned to be patient with that. The estate of Gerald Marsh, my father, is a more complicated matter. The firm he built has been under regulatory review and has lost most of its client base. The partners who remained after the estate sold its shares did not know the full extent of what had been happening, and they are cooperating. The name Marsh & Associates has been removed from the door. My mother hired a different attorney, not the one Marcus had guided her to, and cooperated with the regulator fully. She provided the dissolution filings, explained the phone calls, described the conversations as best she could recall them. She is not facing charges. Whether she should be is a question I'm not positioned to answer and have stopped trying to answer. She is living in the house she shared with my father, and we speak weakly and carefully and with a new and fragile honesty that neither of us quite knows how to hold yet. She told me once, in one of those careful phone calls, that she had not fully understood until recently that loving someone can be indistinguishable from protecting them to the point of harm. I told her I'd been thinking about the same thing. Petra called off the engagement on the Tuesday after the rehearsal dinner, before the documents were public, before Marcus knew the formal action was coming. She called me first. She said, "I'm doing it today." I told her I was proud of her. She said that wasn't what she needed. I asked what she needed. She said, "I need you to come over and help me pack a box." I drove over and I helped her pack a box, and she cried in the way I'd never seen her cry. Not the composed grief she'd shown over our father, but the ugly, body-filling kind that has no dignity and doesn't try to. I sat on her kitchen floor while she cried, and I didn't tell her it would be okay. I didn't tell her anything. I just stayed. We have talked more in the 6 months since than in the previous 6 years. Not easily and not without setbacks. There are things she's angry at me about that are legitimate. The months of knowing before I told her, the specific shape of the timing. I understand that anger and I don't argue with it. I've told her what I can. The rest we are working out slowly, the way sisters who have been badly separated by something big and quiet have to work things out. Rick Beamer's testimony became part of the regulatory record. He told me afterward that saying it officially felt different from the version he'd carried privately for 3 years. He said he'd gone home after the deposition and slept for 11 hours straight. Claudette Oren's statement was entered into evidence, and her notarized records became central to establishing the documentary fraud. She told me, when I called to thank her, that she'd been hoping someone would come back for 8 months and that she'd started to be afraid no one would. "I knew something wasn't right," she said. "I just didn't know who to hand it to." "You handed it to the right person," I said. Sonia consults on 2 more cases for my firm now and has become something in my life that I didn't expect when I first called her. Not exactly a friend, but something close to it. The woman you call when you need someone who knows what it means to be right about something difficult and to have built your certainty out of paper rather than feeling. Aunt Sandra called me a month after the rehearsal dinner to say she'd been thinking about that moment at the table and had wanted me to know that she'd seen it and that she'd thought about it every day since, and that she was glad I hadn't done something dramatic in response. "I thought about it," I told her. She laughed. "I know," she said. "I could see you thinking about it." Part 12. What I Learned to Keep. I still live in the same apartment in Columbus. I still work at the same firm, and I am better at my job than I was 3 years ago, not because I'm technically more capable, but because I have learned something about the particular cost of knowing the truth in a room where everyone else has agreed not to know it. I have become, and I say this with a kind of deliberate precision, extremely good at holding evidence without announcing it, at doing the work while the room continues to perform its ordinary rhythms, at being the person in the corner at the party who is cataloging, who is patient, who is building something real out of documents while the toasts are being made. There is a version of this skill that can become cold. I have been careful about that. I check myself against Petra, who will tell me with characteristic directness, When I've crossed from careful into closed, I check myself against Sonia, who has enough case miles on her to know the difference between productive detachment and the kind that makes you stop caring about outcomes. I care about outcomes. Specifically, I care about the widow who had her retirement redirected into a parking lot and who has, through the civil recovery process, received back approximately 60% of what she lost. It is not everything. It is not justice in the complete sense, but it is something real in her account instead of nothing. I think about her when I am tempted to be cynical about what documentation can accomplish. For 2 years of the 14 months I spent building this case, there were weeks when the weight of carrying it alone was so significant that I would sit at my kitchen table with all the files spread out and feel something close to despair, not because I doubted what I'd found, but because I couldn't yet see the end of it. Couldn't see how a private forensic accountant with a folder of wire transfer records was going to move something as immovable as a dead man's reputation and a living man's confidence. What moved it was not me alone. I want to be clear about that. It was Claudette Oren waiting with her archived copy. It was Rick Beamer carrying his 3-year-old discomfort into a formal statement. It was Sonia Vreeland knowing exactly who to call at the regulator's office. It was Petra choosing, when I put the documentation in front of her, to read it all the way through rather than close the folder. It was my mother in the dark on a vineyard porch, finally saying out loud the thing she'd been not saying for 3 years. None of those people had all of it. I had the most pieces, but I didn't have the whole thing. The whole thing assembled itself slowly, the way truth does. Not as a single revelation, but as a series of convergences, each one possible only because someone else had kept their peace and was waiting for the right moment to hand it forward. Epilogue. The quiet side of the ledger. Here is what I want to leave you with. My father was not a monster. I have thought about this carefully because the temptation, in a story like this one, is to arrive at a single clean verdict on a complicated person, and I don't think clean verdicts honor what's actually true. My father was a man who built something real and became afraid of losing it and made choices, over time, that eroded the line between protecting what he'd built and preserving it at someone else's expense. I believe he told himself the clients wouldn't really suffer. I believe he told himself the amounts were too small to matter. I believe he told himself the partnership with Marcus was expedient and temporary and would be cleaned up before it needed to be examined. People build these stories around the things they're doing that they know are wrong. They build them carefully and they maintain them for years, and they mistake the maintenance for morality. I am my father's daughter. I know something about building careful structures to keep the uncomfortable thing from being visible. The difference, I hope, is in what I chose to build them around. My father built his structure around money. I built mine around truth. I spent 14 months carefully, quietly, precisely constructing a documentation trail that could withstand pressure from people who would very much have preferred it not exist. I did not announce it until it was too sturdy to argue with. I did not perform my certainty in rooms where the performance would have been strategic, but the certainty wasn't yet complete. He taught me that, in a way, the patience, the precision, the understanding that a number that doesn't balance will eventually make itself known, and that the work of accounting is just the work of being patient enough to find where the imbalance lives. I just applied it differently than he did. I'm done carrying the secret now. It's in the record. It's in the court documents and the regulatory filings and the civil complaint and the deposition transcripts. It's in Claudette Oren's notarized copy and Rick Beamer's signed statement and Sonia Vreeland's case notes and my mother's reluctant late-arriving testimony. It's in this story now, which means it belongs to whoever needs it. If you're building something in silence right now, evidence, or a case, or just the plain documentation of what you know to be true, I want you to hear this. The paper is patient. The paper doesn't need anyone to believe it. The paper will wait in a folder in a drawer for as long as it needs to wait, and it will still be true when you're ready to bring it into the light. Keep the records. Date them. Cross-reference them. Find the one person who knows what they mean and trust them enough to share what you have. And when the room is finally ready to receive what you've been holding, and it will be, eventually. You won't need to raise your voice. You'll just need to put it on the table. That's my story. A woman who built a case in silence, and a family that discovered in the end that silence is not the same as surrender. Take care of yourself, and if this gave you something you needed, you know where to find me.